healthcare security exposures from penetration tests webinar. I'm Beth Kolodny, National Sales Manager from Wolters Kluwer, and joining me is Lee, also Marketing Manager from Wolters Kluwer. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our featured speakers, I just want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A menu bar located on the GoToWebinar menu on the right side of your screen, as all lines have been placed on mute. To download a copy of today's presentation, select Handouts on the GoToWebinar toolbar and follow the instructions, or use the URL that was sent out in the reminder email this morning. Today's webinar has been approved for 1.2 CEU credits from the HCCA. An email with a survey and download instructions will be sent within 1 to 2 business days of this webinar. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First, Brian Selfridge, who is a partner at Methodology Services, an IT consulting company with an exclusive focus on healthcare. Brian's an experienced healthcare information security leader with roots in Big Four security consulting. He specializes in identity and access management, IT strategy, web and application security, electronic health record security, and health information exchange services. Prior to joining Methodology, Brian served as the Chief Information Security Officer for an industry-leading healthcare provider. Brian holds a CISSP certification and is also certified by NSA in Health Information System Security and Information Assurance. Lynn Reinheimer is the Manager of ComplyCheck Subject Matter Experts and Sales Engineers for the MediRegs component of Wolters Kluwer. She co-manages the compliance content in ComplyTrack, manages the sales engineer team, leads software demonstration and system trainings and methodology. Lynn's a lawyer, has been a consultant, and has been with ComplyTrack since its inception. Brian?
Great, Beth. Thanks so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody, and looking forward to the conversation. So as Beth mentioned, looking to talk about some of these real-world healthcare exposures. Just in terms of the session today, this is really a culmination of the results of several years running of ethical hacking and penetration testing exercises, specifically for healthcare entities across the country. So we're really excited to share with you some of the insights that we've seen throughout the course of that experience, and hopefully there'll be some areas that you can take back kind of directly in terms of actionable areas that you can take to your own organization to help improve the security posture overall. So just by way of agenda today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the industry context. So, each of our organizations are not functioning within their own bubble. They're kind of playing in the larger industry context of healthcare and information security more broadly. So I want to touch on a few key points there around what's happening across the country and as it plays into penetration testing and ethical hacking and breaches and the like across the board. We'll then spend a little bit of time talking through the anatomy of the penetration test. So what does a typical attack scenario look like, at least in terms of the simulated penetration testing exercises? What are some of those components? What are some of the avenues and kind of the steps and paths that are taken throughout the course of that testing exercise, and highlight kind of how it works a little bit behind the scenes, so you can get a flavor of that. We'll spend a good chunk of time talking through what I think is some of the more salient points for this group, which is the top 10 healthcare security exposures. So we've kind of pulled together all of the various exercises, looked at the again, those real exposures that are affecting healthcare entities across the country, and kind of summarize those in terms of the priority and the prevalence of particular security areas and exposure areas, and want to highlight those. And I suspect some of those areas will be some that you'll be familiar with, especially for the more technically minded audience members, but some may surprise you in terms of how frequently we're seeing certain things or other things that can help you kind of inform your own prioritization of your security program. We'll close things up with a couple areas. One is lessons learned from these penetration testing exercises. So sharing with you some insights around some of the common pitfalls, some of the best practices around conducting these exercises, the frequency, how to go about doing them to make sure you get the most out of the exercise. And then looking forward to, as we conclude, hearing from Lynn from Wolters Kluwer, who will talk through a little bit about kind of the what's next. How do you, what are some of the tools and techniques you can use to track your compliance activities after you go through these types of risk analysis and penetration testing exercises. So lots to cover. Really excited to get a chance to be with you to share these results of this long-running exercise we've had here. So just quickly, Beth did a great job in terms of introduction for me, so that's me. Just wanted to point out ethical hacking has been, and penetration testing has been kind of the foundation of my experience over the course of my career, and I'm excited to get a chance here to focus in on this area with you all and share some of that information. So that's me. I don't want to belabor too much on our bio. All right. So a little bit about industry context. I suspect many of you have noted in the news over the last several years running, but particularly 2015, we're seeing a significant ramp up in breach events in the healthcare industry. And there's several reasons for that. First and foremost, healthcare has become one of the most valuable and sought after kind of data types for fraudsters and the bad guys generally, for lack of a better term. And that's for a few reasons. One, medical records have more versatility and utility, if you will, in the black market. So if you look at, for example, the financial services industry, it's pretty concrete, pretty solid business case there. If they steal your credit card, your bank information, and they get access to money directly, that makes sense. Healthcare is a little bit different. There's a couple different ways you can use a medical record to monetize it and profit from it. So, for instance, medical identity fraud, opening up false insurance accounts so that individuals can receive care at no cost or at the expense of somebody with legitimate medical insurance. It can be used for that purpose. Also, medical records can be used to obtain illicit drugs and prescription drugs and things that otherwise would be directly marketable on a black market. And healthcare organizations and healthcare attackers are realizing that this information can be used pretty broadly, and you see it's kind of culminating in the average medical record is worth $50 on the black market versus $1 for a typical kind of social security number and identity theft type situation. So not only can medical identity be used for those traditional identity theft situations, but they also have this other utility that is leading to folks going after this data. At the same time, healthcare is one of the softer targets out there. So if you look at an attacker trying to gain access to information, if they look at the financial services, that's a hard nut to crack and tough to get in there. Healthcare, on the other hand, is relatively soft target. We'll talk about some of the exposures specifically today, but it's a good combination for the bad guys. It's good marketable data, relatively easy to break in. There aren't quite as much protection mechanisms in place, so that leads to a perfect scenario, kind of a perfect storm, which is why we start seeing hacking incidents in the healthcare industry kind of increasing year over year, almost exponentially. We went from it being mostly about lost and stolen devices, which it still is, in terms of breach events, lost laptop with unencrypted or lost USB device, and that's still happening. But we're seeing a major turn in the tide with respect to these major breaches around Anthem, Blue Cross, UCLA Health System, for example, last year. All getting up in the multi-million records breached, multi-million-dollar fines and repercussions. So we don't anticipate that trend changing anytime soon, and for all those reasons that we mentioned. So when we talk about this penetration testing, ethical hacking, and essentially simulating a real-world attack or a breach event, we're doing it because the industry is driving this way, and there's real kind of impetus and motivation to get ahead of this and avoid being, the next bullet point on this slide come next year, which is really why we do these things. So why should we hack our own systems? It sounds a little like inflicting pain on ourselves for no good reason. Why are we going through this? Well, the reality is we want to simulate that potential attack of an adverse hacker or attacker or somebody with intent on gaining access to sensitive information to monetize that in some way. and be able to identify, above and beyond a traditional kind of compliance look at an environment on security, where you're looking at, okay, do we have the right policies in place? Do we have, are we meeting the letter of the law with respect to compliance? Ethical hacking exercise and pen test tell you very concretely, these are your real exposures. So it's no longer hypothetical. It's no longer just talking about how we align with the security framework or compliance framework. It's about where are the actual holes in our environment and how can we plug them up as quickly and expeditiously as possible, essentially to get to them before the bad guys do. And it's that simple. And so it makes for a good investment, especially if you haven't done one historically or you don't do them very frequently. You'd be surprised at, I think, at some of how easy it might be for some organizations that haven't gone through this exercise. So we'll get to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Now, ultimately, we're driving toward a risk-based protection here, right? So we want to do pen tests to prevent the bad guy from getting in, obtaining sensitive information. But there are still some compliance overlaps. There still are some compliance requirements that drive us to do these penetration testing exercises. So, for example, the HIPAA high-tech and omnibus requirements all kind of drive toward the need to conduct technical testing, including penetration testing. If you look at some of the NIST guidelines, high-trust guidelines, and others, all kind of point toward this as being a requirement and not only a best practice requirement. And HIPAA points back to NIST and other frameworks to guide toward doing this as well. And for those that have payment card data in your environments, if you're a healthcare provider, for example, you may take credit cards in your for donation purposes and your gift shops or your lobbies of patient payments and member payments generally. And so PCI, the DSS Data Security Standard Framework, requires pen testing to be performed on a frequent basis for those environments where credit cards are stored and managed. So if nothing else, certainly from a compliance standpoint, this is a good idea and the right thing to do, above and beyond just getting a handle on where you may potentially have a breach of exposure. So I want to take a moment to walk through the anatomy of a typical pen test, just to give some insight into what steps are taken, kind of lifting the hood, and looking at how the bad guys approach this and how the ethical hacker or penetration tester kind of attempts to simulate that experience. So we follow a pretty traditional methodology that is consistent with the same way that, again, the bad guy will go after things. We start with reconnaissance, so understanding your environment, doing some surveying, networking, scanning to understand where there may be vulnerabilities existent in the environment, and that usually just gives the attacker the ability to get a lay of the land, understand where those weak points may be. And for a pen test, for us as methodology services and others, we follow that same thought process that an attacker would, which is to follow the path of least resistance. So what's the easiest way for us to get in to obtain the most information with the least possibility of detection, essentially, right? So that's the objective of that guy, that's the objective we take. And so that includes performing some testing, and then of those tests and those scans, looking at where are those low-hanging fruit, what is the easiest way to get in, and how can we exploit that. So that includes some manual testing. This is where the human being part of things comes into play at most. So we're looking at the results, manually testing and probing, and then ultimately identifying avenues in and reporting and analyzing back to the organization, how we got in, what the sequence of events look like to be able to stop that attack at any step along the way, and what protections and controls can be put in place to address that. So it's a little bit about the process here, and I'll show you a little bit more detail specifically here in these next couple slides. So what we have up here is a pretty typical scenario for us. Obviously, we've done many of these assessments, and so we've tried to compile down one of the more common kind of what we call a propagation diagram or flow of events from going from no access to obtaining access to sensitive information. And so very typically for us, again, following that same methodology, the attacker will begin by scanning for network vulnerabilities or system vulnerabilities using vulnerability scanning tools or other techniques that are out there, much of which is free or very cheap on the market. So we make sure to use tools that are going to be readily available to the bad guys and don't require any kind of major investments to scan for vulnerabilities. Then in this scenario that we're playing through here, it's very common to identify systems or systems or applications with easily guessable or default passwords, and we'll come back to that in a minute in terms of some of the top exposures. But taking advantage of easily guessable passwords, so things that may be configured on network devices, for example, as a default vendor login account, or medical devices are a great example for the healthcare providers, specifically where there's very often a remote access account configured, or a support account, or some hard-coded generic account that can be known or Googled for or identified that can create exposure and entry point into the environment. As well as just average everyday end user passwords, so your Active Directory passwords, your logins for your end user population, to the extent that they're using weak or easily guessable passwords. Those will be usually the areas that we target first. Having obtained a foothold into the environment, it's very common for us to then look to create a presence on that immediate system and start to look to exfiltrate and access administrative level passwords and accounts from that point forward. So, for example, it's pretty typical to obtain access to a single system. Could be a desktop, could be a server, could be wherever, either through Citrix or some other remote technology aspect. We'll run some hacking tools in order to figure out who's logged into that system historically, which very often could be an IT person with privileged access rights, or there could be some local administrative accounts on there. But basically, whichever accounts have logged into there, we're able to extract those passwords, use some tools to crack them, which ultimately gives us some kind of elevated privileges, very often kind of a domain administrator level, which is kind of the highest level in the Windows environment, level of access. And as you might suspect, once we get to that point of gaining domain administrator level access, it allows us kind of a bit of a skeleton key into the environment to gain access to sensitive information from there. So very often we'll be using legitimate user accounts. So this is one issue that we saw with the Anthem hack and other hacks that have happened recently. By virtue of cracking and obtaining administrator passwords, we're able to then log in with those accounts. It makes it much harder to detect that this is a malicious activity versus some legitimate account. But we use those accounts to obtain information ranging from directly accessing the databases of electronic health records and other kind of platforms that may store large volumes of information, including social security numbers, date of birth, and other information that can be used to either conduct identity fraud or medical identity fraud, or some of the other utilities that we mentioned earlier. We'll also troll through file shares for those in the provider space, especially. You can probably empathize with this. File shares tend to have pretty excessive access control issues and troves of volumes of information, ranging from patient information to financial data and everything else. So we'll spend some time kind of trolling through that information, collecting up, figuring out how much information we're able to pull out of the environment. One area that's not often thought of when we do these assessments, or at least when we kind of bring the results to our clients, is it's more than just patient information. Now, patient information obviously is critical and important and something we need to protect for lots of good reasons. But there's also a ton of organizational information. So, for instance, information about employee information, so benefits, salary details of executives or others within the organization. Direct deposit information. Quite frequently, we're able to gain access to human resources and finance systems that, for instance, would allow us to change the direct deposit number from the employee's bank account routing number to our own malicious account routing number. And that's kind of a quick and easy way to monetize access, and one that I think is not often thought about in terms of the personal impact if someone were to gain access to the company network. We'll also, as a part of these attacks, we'll typically obtain access to Active Directory, which is, again, that Windows kind of administrator level environment, and pull down the password hashes and passwords for all employees and all system accounts within the environment. The reason why this is particularly critical and particularly scary, if you think about it too long and hard, is that we often can be in an environment within a matter of hours, and if we're able to pull down the Active Directory user account hashes, we then can take that offline and crack the passwords on an offline system beyond detection of anybody within the organization. And by cracking those passwords will allow us to log back into the environment with legitimate user accounts, with anybody, essentially anybody in the network with a login account. We could log in as that user and gain access. So that becomes particularly troubling when you start thinking about, well, how do you protect against that, and how do you stop that once you get to that point? So we'll talk more about protection mechanisms in a bit, but that's a little bit about the methodologies we use. One other area that we'll spend some time talking through in a moment is social engineering. It's one of the it's a fancy technical term for essentially tricking people into giving up their passwords or otherwise providing access to the environment without any kind of technical trickery. It's just kind of tricking them into giving up that information. So that could include calling the help desk, pretending to be a legitimate employee, like a physician, for example, that needs their password reset, yelling and screaming, more or less, saying I need my account reset, and you'd be surprised. Many help desk analysts will kind of cave into that pressure and provide a password reset, which then gives us access into the electronic health records, for example. And there's a number of different social engineering tactics and techniques that can play out that we'll talk about, but that's often a common way for us to get a foothold in the environment and then begin kind of propagating through this process that's listed here. One area that's worth a little bit more attention in terms of the typical attack vectors is phishing. And for those that have kind of managed operational security environments, understand that this is a daily battle for sure. And one of the trickier things to protect against, although the technology and the processes are getting better. But phishing essentially is trying to trick a user into giving up information by sending them a well-crafted fake email or other communication trying to get them to enter their password. So, for example, sending a fake email out to individuals saying, hey, I've got this individual who wants to connect with you on LinkedIn. Click here to log in and see what they want from you, and by putting in your credentials, we then are able to capture a password for that environment. Or very often we'll use more targeted attacks that are directed toward the healthcare organization specifically. So, for example, a fake email that says, we are representing the IT department. Your mailbox is full, and if you don't click here to request additional storage space, you're going to stop receiving emails tomorrow, something like that. And that prompts the user to log in with their credentials, and then those credentials get captured and sent off to the bad guys. So that is not something that's hypothetical. That's not something, some kind of weird fancy attack that we're doing. We're seeing in the industry that as a daily occurrence and a daily attack vector because it's easy and it's very low cost for attackers to send out broad brush emails to the organization, and you only need one or two to hit to provide credentials to get that foothold in and then go through that full kind of exploitation I mentioned earlier. The other attack vector that we mentioned a little bit earlier is the social engineering vector. So above and beyond calling the help desk, which we mentioned earlier, making sure that the help desk has the right procedures to make sure they're checking the valid identity of individuals they're calling, and have some way to make sure that I am who I say I am when I call and ask for a password reset or other information. But we'll also actually call employees directly and give them essentially a story, something along the lines of, hey, we're with IT, we need to upgrade your systems. And through a couple of conversations, you'd be surprised about how many employees are willing to give us the password right over the phone. And so the question is, do employees know enough and are aware enough of these potential attacks to redirect that caller to somewhere appropriate and avoid giving out their password information, or at least notify the appropriate folks internally to let them know that there's some suspicious activity going on. And so, surprisingly, we see the statistics from one of our example assessments, but you'd be surprised how many folks will give up their passwords with relatively little prompting. And the same goes for the help desk. The help desk sometimes depends on the analyst you get. Some folks take a stronger stance, others kind of cave into that pressure. So for your own organizations, if you haven't done social engineering as part of a pen test, it can be very enlightening in terms of potential exposure area there. An area that's growing in particular concern and prevalence over the last couple of years is medical device security. Many of the penetration tests that we conduct, we will include a component to look at medical devices specifically, and there's good reason for that. Going back to the whole idea of attacking the lowest hanging fruit and the weakest link in to allow us access, medical devices are very often that weakest link in the chain. Historically, medical devices being anything that's kind of providing direct care to a patient. It could be connected to a patient. It can be things like IV pumps or PACS systems, radiology systems, other things that are directly involved in having a machine or some equipment providing services to the patient. But they're often provided by third-party vendors who, for various reasons, will kind of be a little bit lax on the security side in terms of making sure those devices are patched for security vulnerabilities. They very often have default passwords that can be used across environments to allow for the ease of remote access for support purposes, and they just become a prime target for entry. And so we're seeing more of these devices become network connected, and also couple that with the fact that these devices have the potential for direct impact to patient safety. They're an area that we want to make sure that you look at to make sure that the proper security controls are in place, not only to prevent a breach event, a breach of patient information, which is of course important, but perhaps more important is making sure that there's no potential, or reducing the potential for adverse impact to patients and their safety directly. So, for example, you may have a weakly configured or an unsecured medical device, and there may be a computer virus that wasn't designed to hurt people or attack these specific systems, but just by virtue of the missing patches and other components, that could potentially impact the functioning of that device, make the device stop working or malfunction in some way that could impact patient's care. So that's really one of the more kind of, I think, startling reasons and visceral reasons to conduct a pen test focused on the medical device piece. So there's a handful of other attack vectors that we'll typically go through that you might consider a typical attack or a penetration test, and that includes account and password testing. Very often when we do access the Active Directory passwords and other application passwords, we'll take them offline and run some graphs and some statistics to find out, how strong are those passwords. And it's interesting exercise because we often hear from, the IT administrative side of things like, oh, we've got it configured, there's controls in place, we have complexity requirements, we require users to change passwords, and we don't have any easy passwords out there. But by conducting this test, we often find that that's not necessarily the case, and there's lots of exceptions that have happened over time, applications that fall outside of the standard centralized control of the IT department or have been granted exceptions over time. And so we end up seeing far more weak passwords in the environment and things that even sometimes IT is not quite aware of. So doing a quick password analysis test is a great way to make sure you get a hold of those. Those accounts, identify where they are and make sure you can close them up appropriately. Other typical tests would include things like wireless testing. How can we get into the environment from the parking lot or from the lobby of the hospital, for example? And what does that take, and what does that mean? Where are those potential exposures? Because those become particularly difficult to track down and track back to once you have somebody that's exploited the wireless environment. It's very hard to find them and to close them out. And then we'll also look at physical security. So where can individuals plug into the network by walking into the environment? So hospitals and healthcare providers, again, focus a lot on them, but physical security is a major problem there because of the openness of access that's been designed for patients and visitors and others, family members, to be able to get access to the healthcare environment. That often means that folks can kind of wander and walk and plug into network devices or log on to workstations that maybe aren't intended for their use, and physical security becomes a big factor and something worth testing. As well as application assessments, so electronic health records, patient portals, and an increasing number of applications servicing the healthcare industry are web-based, either cloud-hosted or hosted internally by organizations. And so understanding the web application-specific vulnerabilities becomes an important kind of flavor of an assessment to understand where those weaknesses may be, because you're publishing on the internet intentionally, so you want to make sure that they're locked down appropriately. So now to the what I think is the more exciting part of things here, the top 10 security exposures. So we've culminated broad categories of having conducted these assessments over several years of where are the real exposures, what beyond hypothetical, what are the exposures that we're seeing. So we've broken it down into the top 10. We'll be starting with the top items first, so working from the most prevalent to the least prevalent, I guess, in this case. So first and foremost, weak and easily guessable passwords are hands down probably 80% of the times that we get into an environment is by exploiting an easily guessable password. And this highlights a couple challenges. One, we talk about password management, and it seems like a very relatively straightforward process. But as long as we are providing single-factor authentication, so password-level authentication from the internet through remote access like Citrix or VPNs or other technologies, your last line of defense is always going to be that password. And so the extent that those are not, that there's default passwords or equal guessable passwords out there, it becomes a low-hanging fruit for the attackers. And very often, a question I'll get is, well, isn't it really take a lot of sophisticated hackery and techniques, and there's nation states investing lots of money to hack into healthcare, and isn't that really something we can't prevent against? And the truth is, it's mostly low-tech stuff, easily guessable passwords. And the next item, plain text credentials, plays right into that. That allows us access in, and it's sometimes as simple as resetting passwords, putting complexity in place, and that's it. And you can stop a good chunk of the attacks. So plain text credentials is another example of that. Very often, once we're able to get a foothold in the environment, either through phishing or through some of the other missing patches or other vulnerabilities, we'll look through the environment for passwords that are not encrypted and available to us. And when we say plain text, it just means you can read the password in a file somewhere, some area where it's not encrypted or masked or otherwise inaccessible. So a common example of that would be many organizations have Active Directory read-only capabilities for most user accounts and service accounts. And what that does is it allows an attacker to troll through Active Directory, and very often we'll see organizations use, for example, the comments field in Active Directory to store passwords for either system-to-system accounts, service accounts, or other kind of administrative level accounts that are large and complex, difficult to remember. And so sometimes it seems kind of easy to say, well, nobody's going to look at Active Directory, so therefore, let's just put them in the comments field. But for an attacker, for us, that's a gold mine. We're able to go and without much work at all, get access to the passwords and move on from there. We also see a lot of folks storing passwords in Excel files, Word documents, either on their desktops and workstations or servers, or on file shares, particularly IT file shares where there's kind of help desk and technical service guides and information that individuals will put the passwords in order to log into systems into those files, or have a big Excel document that includes those passwords. So that's a very common attack vector for us, and it's a very simple way to get in just by using legitimate accounts and passwords. Going down the list, the third one may be pretty self-evident, I think, for those that have been in the technical security space for a while. Missing critical security patches. It's very rare in healthcare that we see organizations that have got patching and vulnerability management down solid. So it's more often that we see organizations where, at a minimum, they'll be missing critical patches for several months running, sometimes several years running, or there was a patch several years ago that just didn't get applied for one reason or another. So this is a bit pervasive throughout the industry. And what that allows us to do as attackers is, particularly the farther back you go with missing critical patches, the easier it is for us to get in. As tools have been developed to exploit these vulnerabilities, tools that just allow you to point, click, and gain access into the environment, very little work. For instance, there's a patch that goes back to 2008 that we're still seeing more often than not in environments. And that patch allows, that missing patch allows us direct administrative level access in very easy, and it's one of the most common vectors we're able to get in, and then move forward to escalating our privileges from there. So can't speak enough about the importance of patch management. I know it's not easily done in some cases, but it's definitely one of the most critical functions out there. Another area that we see when we look into 4 and 5 here, weak database administrative passwords are fairly pervasive in healthcare environments. So, for example, SQL servers running defaults or easily guessable administrative accounts. So those familiar with those environments, there's the SA account, system administrator, or admin accounts where the password is either blank or something easily guessable like admin or password. It sounds really silly. It sounds like, well, how can that happen in the environment? It happens a lot, and a lot of it has to do with, folks standing up their databases initially, kind of clicking through the wizard and saying, yep, let me just keep the defaults or create something easy that I know I'm not going to forget. And then you stand up the database, and then all of a sudden it becomes production at some point, and several years down the line, it's still configured with this easily guessable password. The reason why that's important is not just access to the database itself, but particularly with SQL Server databases, it's possible to escalate those privileges to go from not only having access to the database itself, but then to the server that database is running on, just by the virtue of the way Microsoft systems work. There's a way that we're pretty easily able to make that jump from database to workstation and server, which then allows us to gain access to anybody that's logged into that server. And you can imagine very often that's a privileged individual. So item number 4 is pretty big, and it's one of the easiest fixes. It's easy to scan for, it's easy to fix. So if you think all this stuff is tough and difficult, it's going to cost lots of money, and that's not necessarily the case. This is a pretty easy one to tackle. And then we talked a little bit about default account passwords, but generic accounts, particularly for vendors or training accounts, are very commonly found as something that we can guess at, or defaults that certain vendors use. Like, I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but network device vendors, for example, that have a well-known account named after the vendor that we can usually guess at what that password is if it's not been changed. Moving down the list of additional kind of hacking exposure areas, network shares. Can't speak enough about the importance of network access control around network file shares. So typically we'll see individuals kind of granted file share access for legitimate job purposes when they get access to the environment initially as an employee. And then over time, that access tends to accumulate, and individuals continue to store more and more information, those local files, the PDFs, Excel documents. They're all loaded with sensitive information. We store those on the file shares. And so it creates a bit of a snowball effect where over time you amass a number of people with a number of documents with relatively limited access controls, and it becomes a treasure trove for an attacker. You could spend all the time you need to get all the patient information you need just on file shares alone. So it's very important to spend some cycles and energy understanding how you validate that file share access is appropriate and put in some controls to keep track of that over time. Number 7 here, VNC remote access. So for those that are less technically inclined, VNC is a remote access technology that's usually used by IT or technical service personnel to gain remote access into the environment. It's very often stood up just for servicing workstations and allowing technical people to come in and make changes. But very often we see that set up kind of on an ad hoc basis and then left open with no password or very easily guessable password, which allows us to remote into a system without any kind of detection. And that is surprisingly out there more than you think. It's easily scanned. You can easily scan for it. You can easily shut it down. Again, one of those low-cost, high-impact kind of initiatives. If you haven't looked for that in your environment, most of the vulnerability scanners will pick that up. And the last 3, closing out, file transfer protocols, FTP. Very often there's a lot of anonymous FTP accounts out there allow you to connect without passwords, and there may be a staging information for files that contain sensitive information that are being transferred from one location to another. So making sure there's some password and authentication controls around FTP is important, and of course using secure FTP in transit as well. And we've talked about social engineering and physical security as well, but those are areas that allow us access very frequently. So looking a little bit more detail around some of the riskier practices we see at frankly the majority of organizations we assess. One is having large volumes of medical data on a variety of systems. Now, some of that can't be helped, right? That's the business function. We have applications all over the place. We have systems all over the place. But to the extent that information gets aggregated outside the primary electronic health record, for example, so to the extent you have reporting functions or data analytics going on, and they're creating large extracts of data, or for payment and claims processing, for example, another great example. We have these huge extracts of data outside the primary source system with a variety of security controls, some better than others. That really creates the weak point from a security standpoint. We also see a lot of legacy systems, so outdated operating systems, Windows 2003, Windows 2000, XP, and the like, all of which are no longer receiving security patches. They just become low-hanging fruit for us as an attacker to go after, and certainly create one of the more juicy targets out there for the bad guys. Another problem we see is just relying too heavily on third parties to secure their platforms that they've either hosted in your environment or hosted externally. So medical devices are a great example, but making sure that you don't just say, okay, well, we've outsourced that to such and such vendor. They're in charge of the security, and I'm sure they'll do the right thing. Don't assume they'll do the right thing. It's very often we see a lot of misconfigurations, easy access gains, missing patches, the whole 9 yards. So making sure you do that due diligence of vendors becomes absolutely critical to making sure your environment is protected on the whole. We also see a reliance on too few layers of security. So, for example, passwords. The extent that you've got your environment open to the broad internet, relying on a single password of any individual protecting you from the bad guys, then we're in trouble. Based on what we've seen with the password analysis, it's fairly straightforward to find at least one or more passwords to gain access to. So without a second factor like a text message to the individual's phone with a code or some other kind of second authentication mechanism, relying on a single factor like passwords or single way of security and say, well, that's how we keep everybody out, is simply not effective. Other factors are making sure security gets appropriate funding, and I know every business function always feels like we need more money, but there's some organizations that truly have not invested in a meaningful way in information security and compliance, and so that becomes that kind of handcuffs the folks that are responsible for protecting its information and having the right tools, the right automation to keep up with the attacks that are coming in and the sophisticated tools that are being used by the attackers to be able to have some sort of countermeasures in place, and that does take some targeted investments and some financial investment along the way. And finally, here on this point, those that are conducting risk assessments as part of meaningful use requirements or other business drivers, making sure that there's a technical component associated with that risk assessment is critical. So the extent that folks are doing kind of a compliance checklist of, well, let's just make sure we're quote-unquote HIPAA compliant, go down the list and do an assessment. If that's not coupled with a technical test like a penetration test or some technical deep dive, you may be very well open to some very easily and fixable major exposures that a pen test would identify that a traditional risk assessment would not. And so making sure that there's that overlap is important. All right, so just in summary of some of the lessons learned, we've done a ton of these, and I want to share with you some of the common pitfalls. So we get the question a lot, how often should we test? If you've never done a test before, highly recommend you do one. It's going to illuminate some really low-hanging fruit. I think that with relatively minimal effort, you can make a huge impact on the overall risk posture of the organization and potential for attack. Those that are doing them more frequently, we recommend at least an annual basis, or after any major changes. Healthcare is in a reform cycle, so there's applications, overhauls, upgrades being changed every day. So making sure to come back at least annually is important to identify anything that's cropped up as a vulnerability in the meantime. And then there's other, if you have PCI data, there's requirements to do quarterly assessments. So you may want to do them more frequently than annually, but at minimum, kind of at least testing less. And then it's important to come back and retest over time, especially if you feel like you've closed up some of the security holes. It's best not to assume that they've been closed and make sure that there's a follow-up test and scan and process to make sure that that's been addressed. And so a couple other thoughts of what to look for in a vendor. We've seen some organizations kind of think that they've gotten a pen test or an ethical hacking exercise conducted, but they've really missed a big chunk of the exposure, and these are some of the reasons why. So you want to make sure your vendor has penetration tests that consist of more than just vulnerability scanning. So vulnerability scanning, what I mean by that is taking a tool, running it, looking for missing patches, weak configurations, and then producing a report and saying, okay, we've done a pen test, and prioritizing from there. That's a very important piece of the puzzle. Certainly, vulnerability scanning is critical part of that early scanning process that I mentioned earlier. But you have to go that next step and have a human being go through and actually try to exploit those vulnerabilities and take that whole path through to the PHI, through to the patient information, through the sensitive data, and show how that path occurs, because that's really where the bad guys are taking advantage. They're not just relying on vulnerabilities, but they're using that human knowledge to navigate the system. So you really want to simulate that part of the environment. You also want to make sure, for those in the provider space, that the vendor understands healthcare. And what I mean by that is particularly the nuanced kind of kid gloves you need to go into a healthcare environment. You can't just take out the machine gun and then point it at the front door of the technical environment and say, okay, we're going to try to break in and break it down. Given that we have patient safety on the line and sensitive information systems, you need a vendor that understands where safe tests can be conducted and where you need to kind of be hands off and be more touch and go with certain systems that may be critical or have patient impacting functions. So that's one area we can't stress enough with our clients, and making sure that you understand, the vendor understands the industry and knows where those boundaries are. And also if the vendor understands how to speak to non-technical audiences. So it's one thing to have, usually pen testers are very uber technical people, myself included, but as I wear that nerd hat with pride, but we have to be able to translate that to leadership audiences and those that can make decisions around what to do about this. And so sometimes the sky is falling, techno speak doesn't necessarily meet that objective. So making sure your vendor understands how to have that conversation and is able to provide kind of tailored recommendations to your environment that reflects your industry, that's meaningful and useful, and something you can actually prioritize along the way. So with that, I'm going to summarize a couple key points here, and then looking forward to hearing from the Wolters Kluwer folks on some of their approaches for handling after the penetration test is done, how you can start prioritizing. But healthcare organizations are a soft target. They're becoming a target for hackers. We're seeing the breaches. So it's no longer hypothetical. If you haven't done a pen test, you haven't done technical testing, you're a little bit behind the game potentially, but now it's the time certainly to get in front of it. The value of patient data is just driving that and makes it more valuable for folks to go after healthcare generally. And then regular, pen testing can help you get there. So hopefully you've been able to see, some of the reasons for doing that and some of the top exposure areas that you can take back to your own environments to make some changes along the way. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to talk to ISAM, Information Security Assessment Manager, in terms of how you can take these results of your pen tests and actually make sense of them, prioritize and communicate them. So thanks so much, and Lynn, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes and just talk about some solutions that we have that your organizations can utilize to assist you in the risk assessment and conducting periodic risk assessments. What can you do as an organization as well if you do identify issues? Maybe there's a breach in your organization, and having a good system in place for capturing and managing your remediation of these areas, communicating with employees. So I'm just going to take a quick 5 minutes to do that, and then we're going to have time left at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, you can use your Q&A option on the menu bar to submit those questions for Brian to answer for you. What you're seeing on the screen right now is our Information Security Assessment Manager, or ISAM for short. And what ISAM is going to provide for your organizations is a solution to assist you in being able to assess your IS risk across your enterprise. And what we've done with ISAM is we've integrated into it the High Trust Common Security Framework. So all of the standards and content that are part of that framework that you can utilize to do your own risk assessment, HIPAA, NIST, ISO, COVID, PCI, all of these standards that you can work with, picking and choosing the standards that you want to utilize to conduct a risk assessment, establishing what assets within the system you want to assess. So being able to assess physical locations, being able to assess systems and databases and infrastructure, being able to assess vendors through the application if you wanted to do so, and to really help automate your assessment process, being able to send out the content to the appropriate individuals for response, being able to create corrective action plans based on the answers that are coming into you. There are risk scores that are going to generate to assist you in managing where you might be at a greater level of risk, where you need to focus your attention, where you're doing well, and having a variety of approaches to reporting that you can utilize. So what I just have up on the screen now is what a respondent would see as they go through and answer whatever controls you send out to them. So all of the questions are in a yes-no format, while at the same time giving the respondent the ability to include comments. You can force comments if you want to. Supporting documentation can be attached to function as evidence and support the answers that are being given to these questions. You can identify threats and vulnerabilities specific to your organization. You can see, the respondent can see exactly where the questions are being taken from. So there's an educational component within the system for the respondents. And as you're going through and you're doing these assessments, having the ability to generate an extensive amount of reporting. And I don't have the time to take you through a dozen reports, but you can get a little preview on the screen of what you can do with the reporting. Text and data reports, analytical reporting that will allow you to generate heat maps and work with scorecards, stakeholder reports for when you have to present to the board or other types of stakeholders, that you can utilize this to do HIPAA assessments. You can utilize this to assist you in your meaningful use activities and the ongoing risk assessments that you need to be conducting. So that's ISAM. I also want to mention that we have a solution called the Activity and Event Manager. And this is an enterprise-wide tool. This is not necessarily IS specific, but you can use it throughout your organization. And what it's doing is it's giving you a place where you can capture all of the things that you do and you deal with on a daily basis. So if there is a breach incident, maybe something was faxed to the wrong number, maybe some information gets lost that you have to be able to address as an organization, that you can capture these issues and incidents that arise. You can involve the appropriate people in the process within the system. And again, being able to do analytics and generate reports so that you can look for patterns and you can see are the same types of issues continually occurring. Are they occurring in the same locations? Are they involving the same people? It can help you determine where you might need to do more education with your employees and with your staff, where you might need to create new policies or change your procedures, that you can manage all of this information within the system. And without bringing it up on the screen, I do also want to mention that we also have a survey tool. A survey tool that gives you the ability to create surveys on anything you want that you could send out potentially to your entire employee population. So when Brian was talking about passwords and perhaps employees not knowing what they can and can't do with the passwords and who they can and can't give that information to, you could query them through the survey manager and see what employees are aware of and if they know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. You could disseminate policies to employees to make sure that they have them, that they've read them, that they understand them. So it's a nice way to be able to communicate potentially with a large number of individuals. So those were my 5 minutes. I promised I wouldn't go over, but just a number of tools that we provide, some of which may be hitting areas as an organization that perhaps you need to focus more on. So at this time, I am going to turn this back to Beth to see if there are questions that have come in that we can answer in our remaining time.
There's lots and lots of questions. There's so many questions. I know we're not going to have time for them, but I want to promise everybody we will get back to you with your question and we'll get you an answer. Someone will reach out to you because there's so many questions and they're great. So first of all, Do you recommend companies require ethical hackers sign a BAA before the pen test begins, Brian?
Great question. Great question. You don't necessarily have to. I think it makes sense though. So given the fact that we as Metapology, for example, will, if we're successful in the penetration test, at least in obtaining unauthorized access to PHI, we're going to be seeing that PHI, and so therefore, we don't keep that information, but we have access to it. So I think a BAA makes sense. It's not necessarily required, but I think it's a good idea.
Do you ever look at a particular employee in an organization, Google them, and then try to figure out potential passwords?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. That's especially part of the social engineering piece. When we do the phishing attacks, the social engineering attacks, we'll use, for instance, employee LinkedIn information. Understand when we call the help desk, we'll find a real physician or a real user, find out what department they work in, where they are. We'll look up information about them. Then we'll call the help desk, and we'll know lots of information about that. We'll say, we're this person. We can speak intelligently to it. Or if we're calling the end user directly, we may find out some information about them. We repeat that to them, engender some trust, and then ask them for the password, essentially. So we do that often, and I'm certain the attackers do as well. It's with all that public information, it becomes just a tool to help be more effective in some of the attacks that we've mentioned today.
Thank you. Does multi-factor authentication, a one-time use code, for example, sent via text to a cell phone, help with security? Is this or similar approach being used in healthcare?
Yes, and yes. It's huge. I mean, in terms of, if you look at most healthcare entities, they're going to have some remote access technology, Citrix or VPNs, picking on those. But if those are only password protected, that means anybody with internet access across the world in various external countries that may want to grab information can get access directly to attempt to access your systems through a single password. And knowing how weak passwords are, we talked about it some today, we know that's a recipe for folks who are going to get in. So two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, call it what you will, has absolutely been becoming the standard in healthcare, particularly for those remote access portals that allow individuals to make sure they validate who they are, who they say they are, through something more than a password, because we know passwords just aren't going to cut it.
And here's a question, therefore. What is your official definition of a weak password?
Sure. Great question. So certainly anything less than 8 characters is a start. Anything that's easily guessable. So if you look out there, I didn't want to name passwords specifically here, but there's lists of top 100, top 1,000 passwords that are produced by every organization that's ever hacked anything. And you'll see on those, that's the list. That's the list that everybody uses. So it could be the word password, password123, P @ SSWORD, QWERTY, QWERTY. So those that don't know that can look at the top of their computer keyboard and know that lots of individuals think that's a clever way to create a password, and it's not necessarily. So the passwords are well known. I mean, there's only so much stuff we can hold in our brains. So if we attempt to use the most common, what I call weak passwords, we're more often than not going to get in with somebody's account that's using one or more of those, and even the top 100 passwords that are out there. So that's what I consider weak password, anything that's been in that ballpark. And then, of course, the complexity requirements, 8 characters, alphanumeric, special character are important as well.
Do you consider Fitbits part of the concern, and things like Fitbit?
Everything's a concern. It depends on how much you care about it. On the range of things that keep me up at night or kept me up as a security officer, and now my clients, Fitbit, yes, you should do a risk analysis of it. How's it being used? How's it integrating? Just like you would any other application coming into the environment, but it's not on the top of my list of things to be worried about. Look at the top 10 list of stuff we talked about today. Look at your servers, your remote access, your network devices, your passwords. Start there. Fitbit is probably way, way, way down the priority list of things to worry about if you haven't tackled all those other areas.
Are you aware of medical device manufacturers being forced to build in security, user accounts, logins, automatic locking of a session, encryption, etc.?
Well, forced is an interesting word. There's no forcing happening anywhere of anybody. There's regulations that drive you toward. Obviously, HIPAA requires you to do a lot of that stuff. The FDA had some guidelines that you could argue they're forcing or not forcing. They're certainly recommending medical devices adhere to. The bottom line is, regardless, medical device platforms and vendors and applications are not being configured securely. So if I don't want to play the blame game too much. If it's the vendor that's responsible for that, or the healthcare provider, or both, that conversation is not happening and it's getting dropped. So I think the industry is trying to figure that out in terms of quote-unquote forcing folks, but I don't think there's a whole lot of forcing going on outside of actually having breaches and then reacting to them.
Okay, we are kind of over, but I want to ask one question more because I think it's an easy one to answer, and the rest I promise we'll get back to. If credit card payment machines processing is outsourced to a third party, does the PCI DSS penetration testing requirement at the hospital still required?
It's not if the data is not stored on or transmitted on through the hospital systems platform. So it's a bit of a nuanced answer. Most of the third-party payment processors have a technology in place and figured out a way to keep that data out of your systems. If you're not storing it locally, you don't have to conduct a pen test. But if you have any point where you're taking that information, somebody's writing it down in an Excel document or a paper form, or you're storing it somewhere locally, then your network comes in scope for PCI and you have to do this stuff. So it depends on how you have things set up, but there are ways to be creative and really outsource that truly to the third parties.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. As I said, we have more questions you'll be hearing from us, including a few product questions, but frankly, I wanted to take the time to talk to you directly and get your answers, Brian. So thank you, everyone, for your interest. Thank you very much for your questions and for attending. If you have any questions, let us know, or you'll hear from somebody soon. Thank you very much.